Welcome back to the channel. Adam Harris, ring announcer, wrestling fan, and collector here in the Mountain State. And today's episode is going to be all about the PWI 500. This year's 2024 is the 34th edition of the Pro Wrestling Illustrated top 500 wrestlers in the world, as decided by the editors of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. But we're going to talk about the 26 people from this year's 500 that I've ring announced in my 9-year wrestling career. Looking forward to digging through this and talking PWI here on the channel. All right, I've been digging through this list incessantly for the past couple weeks. I've been talking about it here on the channel. Looking forward to talking with you guys about the 26 people that I've announced from this year's PWI 500. But I wanted to talk about my memories of the PWI 500. Some people may not put much credibility or much weight into the PWI 500. I am sentimentally attached to it, I think, because wrestling magazines were such a big part of my life as a wrestling fan as a kid. I started watching in 1991, which was the first year they did a PWI 500. I don't necessarily remember that issue, but I started looking back through all the covers of the PWI 500s, and definitely the 1993 PWI 500 would have been the first one I think I remember reading, picking up at the newsstand. I remember that iconic cover, and also the 94 cover is pretty big as well. Both those were topped off by Bret the Hitman Hart, who, as a young man at 11, 12 years old, I was a huge fan of Bret Hart. And he went from the Intercontinental Champion to the World Champion. He was the epitome of what a career arc of a wrestler should look like. And, he was my favorite wrestler at the time. So, and in 95, of course, that's an iconic cover as well. That was the year that Diesel was the number one wrestler, of course, a legendary low year in the wrestling business. But as a wrestling fan, as 13 years old or whatever, man, I thought wrestling was awesome in 1995. I was on board and loving wrestling at that time. What I loved about the 95 one is there are some wrestlers that you'll remember. Tracy Smothers was number 26. Shane Douglas was number 28. Tony Anthony, the dirty white boy, was number 37 in that year. Number 37 this year was Logan Paul. If that gives you any idea of how much more elite the competition is these days, if you want to compare the dirty white boy Tony Anthony to Logan Paul. And I went back and looked at the first PWI 500 in 1991, the first 500, and I've announced 4 out of the top 10 wrestlers that were ranked in 1991. Of course, a lot of those for appearances, not necessarily matches, but I have introduced Lex Luger, Arn Anderson, Ricky Steamboat, and Rick Steiner, who were all in the top 10 in 1991. So let's get to it and talk about the 26 wrestlers that I've ring announced in this year's PWI 500. I'm just going to dig down from 400, 300, 200, 100 into the top guys who ranked the highest that I've ring announced here in West Virginia before, and in Ohio and in Kentucky. I've been fortunate enough to ring announce for 3 different promotions. And I think there's a couple more who are actually included in the wrestlers that I've announced on the list. You'll hear me talking about them: Appalachian Championship Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Conquest, and of course, All-Star Wrestling, ASW, who I've been ringing announcing for the longest. And they are the one I announce for most frequently. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of people in the 500 and under. There's a lot of people in the 300 and under. And then there's only 2 in the 200s. And 3 people made the top 100. So I'm going to talk about some of these wrestlers, starting in the 400s with number 472, Johnny TV, who I got to announce at the Bash in Beckley. He had me announce him as Johnny West Virginia at the Bash because, as we found out on the way down, he actually has some family ties to West Virginia. I think Parkersburg is where his mother was from. He told this great story about attending his mom's high school reunion, and he came out to the ring in a West Virginia jersey. Great way to get a hometown reaction here in the Mountain State. At number 435, Fuego del Sol, who I announced for Battleground Wrestling. Number 410, Vinny Pacifico. He's listed as the energy drink king, and that's for sure. I remember I had to take him to Walmart to get a particular brand of energy drink. I think it was C4. Number 408 is Cheeseburger, who is one of the guys I've announced most recently here in ASW. He stepped up and wrestled Huff Manley not too long ago. They had a heck of a match. It was Huff Manley's return to All-Star Wrestling, and really cool to get to work with Cheeseburger. And then 2 guys that were ranked in the 400s. One of the guys is somebody I've announced probably as many or more times than anybody on this list, coming in at 429, is Facade. Michael Facade from up in the Pittsburgh area, the Neon Ninja. He's been at ASW and Conquest over the years. He's really a mainstay in the independent scene here in West Virginia, and a former winner of the Super Indy up in Pittsburgh. And I mention that because the guy who won this year's Super Indy from IWC in Pittsburgh is Sam Hardway Holloway, who came in at 403. I've announced him so many times this year for Appalachian Championship Wrestling. He's such a cool big man. He's a versatile performer. I've seen him in singles competition and in those famous ACW scrambles, tag team action. The man can do it all. And so I won't be surprised if we see Sam Hardway Holloway ranked way up higher than number 403 in next year's PWI 500. Getting into the 300s now at 397, Matthew Justice, the lifer, who I got to announce for Pro Wrestling Conquest. As a tag team, they were the tag champs for Pro Wrestling Conquest. His tag partner, a little further up on the list, we're going to get to him in a minute. Chris Adonis, also known as Chris Masterson, the Masterpiece. Chris Masterson is somebody I got to drive down to Harts, West Virginia. He came in at number 348. That was a couple years ago now. Also, Joshua Bishop, number 365. And if you read in his description, it mentions that he defended his ACW championship against Rhino and against Heath in back-to-back nights. And I was able to be there for both of those nights this year. And so cool that that got mentioned in the PWI 500. Josh Bishop, man, endless potential. Looks like what a professional wrestler should look like. He's been getting the nod in GCW recently. Showed up on Impact this year. Another guy I could see moving way up the ranks. And two of the other people I announced Bishop wrestling against. Rhino came in at number 307. I've announced Rhino many times, but even this year for Appalachian Championship Wrestling, and also this year at 375 was the Bev, Bobby Beverly, a former ACW champ. Him and Josh Bishop had some real wars for Appalachian Championship Wrestling. So the Bev coming in at 375. At number 362 was PB Smooth, who I announced back in 2018. He may be the one I've announced the longest ago. It was at a Halloween show, I believe, when PB Smooth was in ASW. 344 was Dirty Dango, another recent one I picked up. It was Halloween this time last year. He worked a show with Earl Hebner against a guy named Jeff Paul. They had a recreation of the Montreal Screwjob. It was an awesome match. Really cool to get to work with Dirty Dango, who told me because he grew up in the business with Heath and they were roommates, he felt like he was an honorary West Virginian. And I agree. Dirty Dango is all right with us. Coming in at number 368 was Lexus King, but he was not Lexus King when I announced him the first time. It was at ASW, and it was really interesting to look back on now because he had not gone to AEW at that point. AEW was very new in 2019, and I remember Pillman was still kind of figuring it out, and I said, so do you want me to say Brian Pillman Jr.? Do you want to be Flying Brian Pillman Jr.? And he was still trying to figure it out. He was asking, what do you think? He's like, what should I do? Should I be Flying Brian? Should it be Brian Pillman Jr.? And I always defer to the guys. I say, you would tell me what you want me to do, and that's what we'll do. But as you can tell, he's way more successful right now than he's ever been before as Lexus King on the NXT brand. Excited to see where he ranks this time next year. And then someone else I announced, I've announced many times. I think the first time I announced Kerry Morton was actually when he was either still in high school or just out of high school, and he was singing the national anthem. Kerry's literally been coming to ASW his entire life. As a young man, was running around backstage at ASW. Gary Dameron's told me those stories. And Kerry is in the NWA now. Really cool to see a guy grow so much in the business so quickly. And again, he'll probably be ranked much higher this time next year. And rounding out the 300s, I wanted to talk about Landon Hell at number 380 because he was on the same show with the Rock and Roll Express and somebody else who made it on this list. One of the people a little further up on the list was there that same night. I'm going to throw a picture in later of Landon Hell, who had a nice feature in this year's PWI. Photo of Landon Hell along with some of the other stars who were in attendance at ASW that night. And in the 200s, 256 is Eddie Edwards, current member of the system. He's tagging with Brian Myers right now. But when I ring announced him in 2022, it was the Fashion Beckley. Him and Davey Richards, the American Wolves, reunited against FTR. And yes, that match did happen. Some, including those who were in it, have tried to acknowledge that that match didn't happen or have alluded that they would love for that match to take place. but we were there at the Bash in Beckley. Many of us were, at least, to witness that legendary tag match. And it was a legendary tag match indeed. I'll never forget it. And Edwards, a totally cool guy. I also drove him down to a show that we did inside the hallowed halls of the Williamson Field House in Williamson, West Virginia. Him and Matt Hardy on the bill together. That was a fun show as well. Drove with Eddie down there. What a cool guy. Really fun to talk with him. Boston guy, and such a sweetheart. Grew up in the business, trained in Japan, a true veteran and a legend in his own right. Eddie Edwards, awesome guy to work with. Coming in at number 215, speaking of the Bash in Beckley, love this guy. I think he'll be higher on the list. If he's not on NXT or in WWE this time next year, I'm not sure what is wrong with wrestling, because Richard Holiday is a real deal. Gifted performer, great look. He's got the gift of gab as well. And I got to announce him at this past year's Bash in Beckley against Brock Anderson. And Brock will probably end up getting on this list if things keep going his way next year. But that match was awesome. And I had a chilling moment where, of course, Arn Anderson accompanied Brock to the ring. And I had already introduced Richard Holiday. He's got a great introduction. You are now breathing the rarefied air of Richard Holiday, which I love. And then I didn't know that the Horsemen's music was going to play. That's what they used for Brock when Arn brought him out to the ring. And I got chills in the ring when I heard the Horseman music. They're in Beckley within the Armory. It's Horseman country here in West Virginia, in case you didn't know. And boy, Arn got pop of the night. But I saw him from inside the ring down at ringside. I could see Arn Anderson looking up at Richard Holiday, and he looked and he just did one of these things. He didn't have to say anything, but we all knew what he meant. And it was chilling. And I always remember having that moment, sharing that moment with Richard Holiday right across the ring, who's getting that look from Double A, the enforcer, Arn Anderson, a legendary moment in my personal ring announcing history. And the third and final person in the 200s who makes the list of people I've ring announced at number 203, Danhausen. Very nice, very evil. Of course, coming up again to ASW in November for War Games. Very nice, very evil. They just announced he's going to be taking on Caleb Conley, former NWA star and former Impact star, current star of the Indies. He's all over the place. That'll be a great match, no doubt. Looking forward to having Danhausen back. The first time I worked with him was on the show that Landon Hale was on that I mentioned earlier, as well as the Rock and Roll Express. And I have the distinct honor. I have to be the only person in the world who drove to a show with Danhausen and Rock and Roll Robert Gibson. It was quite an experience, man. Just listening to those two chat was great. And Danhausen was injured at that time. And it really was touching to me the way Robert turned into a caring and loving uncle-like figure as soon as he saw Danhausen on his crutches. He went to grab his bag. Oh, let me help. What happened to you, man? Let me help you with this. And I will always remember that. You know, Robert turned into this caring and loving figure when he saw that Danhausen was injured. I'll never forget it. And then there's some great photos from that show with Danhausen sporting the mullet because he accompanied the Rock and Roll Express to the ring that night. And I think there's one of Landon Hale with some of those guys as well. That was such a great show in Harts, West Virginia. And I think Danhausen will be even more pleased with the crowd we get in Madison when he returns to ASW in November. All right, there's 6 people from number 100 into the highest ranked performer that I've announced, and we're into the 100s now. Coming in at 166, Joe Alonzo, who I realize now is like really still tearing it up for MLW, and I got to announce him a couple times. He was at one of the bashes as well, and man, this guy got some heat at ASW. He is a legendary heat seeker, Joe Alonzo. Love his entrance, his announcements. You know, he worked with me on it, and I remember him complimenting me. He said, "Hey, I like the way you did that. You said, this is Joe Alonzo." And man, those compliments I really love. You know, I don't do it for them, but if a performer has enough gratitude to say, "Hey, I thought that was good," I really appreciate that feedback. So even though Joe Alonzo, hugely hateable guy, he will be over with me forever just for giving me that compliment backstage the first time I announced him. And at 141, Myron Reed, a well-deserved slot, could probably even be even higher on a technical basis. Myron Reed, a former member of the Rascals, and was at Slam Plaza this year. Slam Plaza 3, downtown Charleston this year. Had an awesome match with Troy Parker, another guy who I think we're going to see on the list next year. Made the BW 500 this year. And I'm going to get to the people in one of these videos from that list that I've announced as well. And of course, we just found out that our girl Freya made the women's 250. So maybe I'll be able to go through there and see how many of those ladies I've been able to ring announce here in West Virginia. And at number 114, a gentleman who's wrestled for ASW. We did a Chili Fest show in Beckley, West Virginia that Ace Austin was on, and he's at 114. But he was also at kind of the precursor to Slam Plaza. He wrestled at the Elk City Wrestling Party, which was produced by my friend Bishop Baylor. I got to ring announce that day. Was when I first got to know him. And I'm pretty sure Ace Austin wrestled Atticus Cougar on that show. It was outside. They booked it because AEW was in town. It was the first time AEW came. It was one of their first shows. First 5 television tapings were in Charleston, West Virginia. And my boy Bishop had the foresight to throw a wrestling party outside of his barbershop on the west side of Charleston. It was so fun, so legendary, because AEW was in town. It was like an afternoon show, and everybody could walk from there to the Civic Center for AEW. And it rained like hell, man. But we had an awesome show. The turnout was still strong. It would have been much better had we not had that rain. But, man, what a great show that was. And shout out to Bishop Baylor for getting that whole ball rolling. That truly is the event that led to Slam Plaza and the Sternwell Slamboree and the city's involvement with professional wrestling here in Charleston. So, wonderful event. I'll always remember getting to introduce Ace Austin for the first time. And he was on Impact at that time. Maybe even the X Division champion. And he had just done this spot with a trash can that I remember. And I complimented him on that. He was like, man, hoping to go viral with that. Do whatever you can do to get over. That was in 2019. Wow, cool. And we're into the 3 guys who made the top 100. They're all kind of packed in together in this area. The 3 guys I've ring announced from the PWI 500, starting with number 79, Old Manser. He's the tag partner of Matthew Justice. They were the Pro Wrestling Conquest tag team champs. I got to ring announce them. In most recent time, I ring announced for Pro Wrestling Conquest. The Second Gear Crew always have legendary matches. And then coming in at number 77, the Deathmatch King, the Indie God, the complete Matt Cardona came in at number 77 this year. What can I say, man? He was great to ASW, had a great run as the ASW champion. The major players came back and wrestled a tag match for Gary and ASW. Of course, he had the legendary cage match with Heath for the ASW championship at the Bash in Beckley and faced Richard Holiday in one of his ASW title defenses. So I've ring announced Matt Cardona many times, dating back to just after the pandemic. I think he came for the first time in 2021, and always a pleasure to have the complete Matt Cardona in the house here in West Virginia. And one of the more interesting trips I took was with Cardona and Myers when they came as the major players, and Jeff Jarrett was riding shotgun. The 3 of us rolling in a minivan all the way down to Madison, West Virginia. It was cool. They were talking shop about Major Bendy's, man. It was awesome. Conrad this and Conrad that. Legendary. And number 75, the top ranked wrestler in the PWI 500 that I have had the pleasure of ring announcing here in West Virginia. Number 75, what a year this gentleman had. Ethan Page, the former NXT champ, just became number 1 contender again as I'm taping this. And what a year he had. And at that time, this was, I believe, in 2021, maybe. I need to double check that, but Page was definitely still figuring out his role in AEW. He was starting to get a push at that time, and I remember us talking about it, and he was really trying to figure it all out because he had so many dates and conventions booked already. You know, this guy's built an amazing following on YouTube. He's a fig hunter himself, and I really picked his brain about the YouTube channel a little bit, and complimenting him because he has such a great style, has such a loyal following, and his vlogs are great. And he has a great following, and therefore it was like he was really trying to balance his AEW dates with all the conventions and signings that he had done independently and booked himself. and that AEW schedule was starting to increase for him at that time, and he was really dealing with that when I drove him to ASW. And man, he's since gone from there to great things at NXT, man. And I knew he could do it. He is a incredibly talented individual in the ring, out of the ring, knows his mic skills, knows how a camera works, knows how an audience works, knows what it takes. I think he is a wonderful heel in NXT. Congrats to Ethan Page, the guy who came in at number 75 in this year's PWI 500 that I've been able to ring announce. And that's all 26 guys. Took me a while to put this video together. I'm glad I did the research, because just last night I realized that I hadn't put Eddie Edwards on my notes for this show. So it was 26 guys all along. And who knows, I may be leaving somebody out. And I want to give a shout out here at the end of the video to my buddy Al Scott, better known as Fan in the Van, better known as Big Alboski. Some guys even call him the Party Dude. But he keeps an incredibly detailed log of every wrestling show that he goes to. And he and I, over the last few years, have become great friends, and also partners in sharing data at shows that maybe he was at and didn't have notes from. More often, I have no notes, and I ask him for notes of shows that I worked or I ring announced. And he already found a couple guys that I had forgotten I had even ring announced from the BW 500 that I am going to touch on maybe in a future video. Maybe do that. And the women's 250? I'm not sure, but hopefully this video does okay. It was a heavy lift, and I appreciate you guys watching along here on the channel. This is Adam Harris, ring announcer and wrestling fan and collector here in West Virginia. Thanks for tuning in. See you at the matches. See you next time.